There are few things in life as satisfying as watching karma deliver an icy cold punch to the face of someone who truly deserves it. And if you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA president, you know exactly the kind of people I'm talking about. But let me take you back to the moment it all began with one simple, absurd, and absolutely mind-blowing encounter. My Snowblower vanished overnight, and the security footage showed none other than my neighborhood's self-proclaimed queen, Brenda Smith, dragging it into her garage like she had just liberated it from danger. But the real kicker? She claimed it was an HOA requisition for community safety. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a neighbor. I was dealing with a dictator in fur-lined boots. Now, to understand how we got there, let me paint the picture of my winter haven. My name's Mark Johnson. I'm a retired firefighter who decided to trade sirens and city chaos for a peaceful life out in the snowy outskirts of town. I bought myself a sturdy old cabin nestled on 3 acres of land, just far enough from the city to breathe easy, but close enough to grab a hot cup of coffee and gas when needed. I like things quiet, simple. I had a few essentials for winter: a heavy-duty snowblower, a backup generator, and enough firewood to last until May. I wasn't bothering anyone, and that's exactly how I liked it. At first, life here was perfect, until Crestwood Village expanded. The town decided to develop a neat little housing community just down the road, complete with pristine lawns, pastel-colored shutters, and people who couldn't stand a single leaf out of place. That was fine. Live and let live, I figured. We could coexist. After all, I was on my own private land with no HOA rules, no shared fences, and certainly no interest in anyone else's property. I waved when neighbors passed. I plowed my own driveway. I even helped a couple of folks dig their cars out during last year's blizzard. I thought I was building goodwill. Then came Brenda. You know how some people walk around with the kind of energy that makes you feel like you've already done something wrong just by existing? That was her. The first time I met her, I was on my front porch enjoying a quiet morning with coffee in one hand and my dog, Duke, curled at my feet. The snow had just started to fall, a beautiful, silent drizzle that blanketed everything in white. I heard boots crunching up my walk and looked up to see her marching straight toward me, clipboard clutched like a weapon, lips pursed like she'd just sucked on a lemon. "Mr. Johnson," she said without even a hello, "I'm Brenda Smith, president of the Crestwood Village Homeowners Association. I'd like to have a word about your snowblower." I blinked, genuinely confused. My snowblower? She didn't miss a beat. Yes, it's visible from the street, and that violates our community aesthetic standards. I took a sip of coffee to buy myself a moment. "Brenda," I said slowly, "I don't live in your community." She tilted her head and gave me the kind of look you give a toddler who's just said something embarrassingly wrong in public. "Well, technically no, but your property borders the development, and visibility is part of the shared environmental standard. We strive to maintain a uniform look for all properties that can be seen from Crestwood." I genuinely laughed, not a sarcastic chuckle, but a full-bodied laugh that came from the gut. "Lady, I own this land. You can't enforce HOA rules on me." That smile of hers, tight, controlled, but with a twitch at the corner like her face was trying not to explode, stayed frozen in place. "Let's try to be cooperative," she said. "You could simply move the snowblower to your backyard. It's an eyesore and a safety hazard in icy conditions." "I use it every day," I replied. "It's positioned near the garage, so I don't have to drag it through 3 feet of snow. It's not going anywhere." Brenda's eyes flicked to my dog, to the stack of firewood, then back to me. She didn't respond. She simply made a note on her clipboard, turned on her heel, and marched back down my driveway like she owned the place. I should have taken that as a warning. Over the next few weeks, I started getting mail, not regular mail, HOA mail. Formal letters on Crestwood letterhead, addressed to the property owner adjacent to Lot 7. The first was a gentle reminder about neighborhood visibility standards. The second one was more aggressive, warning me about escalating noncompliance. The third came with a fine for $150 for a snowblower that wasn't even on their land. I ignored them all. Then, one morning after a particularly rough snowstorm, I stepped outside to clear the driveway, and the snowblower was gone. I thought maybe one of the neighborhood kids had pulled a prank. But when I checked my security camera, what I saw made my blood run colder than the ice in my gutters. It was Brenda, dressed in a white parka, dragging my snowblower away like a predator hauling off a kill. She had the nerve to bring two HOA volunteers with her, one holding a printed policy and the other holding her stupid clipboard like it was a sacred text. They rolled it right down the street and into her garage like it was some kind of righteous confiscation. I couldn't believe it. She actually stole it. Not borrowed, not asked for help, just took it. I stormed down to her house, knocked like the devil himself. When she opened the door, I could see my Snowblower sitting in her garage, just behind her shoulder. She smiled, a sickly sweet, fake, smiling smile. "Oh, Mark," she said like we were old friends. "Thank goodness you're here. I was just going to contact you. We've relocated your Snowblower for community safety. It was too close to the public pathway, and we had several complaints." "From who?" I growled. She didn't answer. "It's now part of our emergency response equipment for Crestwood. In the event of a major storm, we'll ensure shared access for snow removal." "You mean you stole my Snowblower?" "Let's not be dramatic," she said with a light laugh, already closing the door. "This benefits everyone." That was the moment something in me snapped. She thought she had won. She thought because she had a clipboard and some made-up rules, she could do whatever she wanted. She had no idea what was coming. And that was the day I decided I wouldn't just take it back. I would make her wish she'd never seen a snowflake again. It's funny how theft doesn't feel real until you see the evidence with your own eyes. Watching Brenda haul away my Snowblower like she was doing a public service flipped a switch in my head I didn't know I had. The kind of switch that turns a man from polite neighbor to silent war tactician. I didn't yell. I didn't rage. I didn't even call the cops. I simply watched that footage again and again until the disbelief burned off and left something much colder behind. This wasn't about a Snowblower anymore. It was about control. And Brenda was about to learn what happened when she picked the wrong guy to play HOA games with. The morning after the theft, the snow was relentless. A thick, wet blanket coated everything in a foot of frozen white. My driveway looked like a glacier runway, and without my Snowblower, I had to clear it the old-fashioned way. Shovel by shovel, I cursed under my breath, not from the cold or the labor, but from the sheer audacity of what had just happened. Brenda didn't ask. She didn't knock. She didn't offer compensation or explanation beyond her deluded belief that she was some kind of winter overlord. No, she just decided that since she didn't like how I stored my Snowblower, it now belonged to her. And what's worse, she used the veil of community protection to justify it. Classic HOA logic. Strip people of their rights and call it order. Later that afternoon, I did go to her house again, this time calm but direct. When she opened the door, her tone was all sunshine and syrup. She had the nerve to offer me a cup of tea, said she hoped there were no hard feelings, that reallocating community tools was perfectly normal in developments like ours. Ours, she said, as if I'd ever agreed to be part of her little pastel-colored kingdom. I didn't bother arguing. I told her flat out that she had until sundown to return the Snowblower. She didn't flinch, just smiled and said, "We'll have to bring that to the HOA board. They'll determine its appropriate usage going forward." So that was it. Brenda had stolen my property, was refusing to return it, and had managed to convince herself it was perfectly reasonable. I went back home, hands trembling, not from cold but from fury, and sat down to figure out my next move. A few hours later, a new envelope appeared in my mailbox. No postage, just a folded HOA notice slipped in like a thief. This one was printed on heavy cream paper, the kind they probably think makes their threats look more official. The wording was priceless. "Dear community member," it began. "Due to your previous noncompliance with neighborhood aesthetic ordinances and failure to secure hazardous equipment, the HOA has taken emergency action to safeguard the well-being of local residents. Your Snowblower has been temporarily impounded for community access." Temporarily impounded, as if we were living in some dystopian subdivision where tools were seized for the greater good. I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the fireplace. That night, I barely slept. I sat at my kitchen table, watching the snow pile up outside, and began planning. Not just how to get my equipment back, but how to make sure Brenda understood that taking something that didn't belong to her would have consequences. The next morning, I decided to test just how far she was willing to go. I sent a written request, purely for documentation, to the HOA office. Brenda ran out of her converted sunroom. I asked for the return of my Snowblower, citing property ownership and lack of HOA jurisdiction. The response came within hours, shoved into my mailbox like a smug little grenade, request denied. Equipment now considered community property under Emergency Winter Ordinance 4C. I looked up that ordinance. It didn't exist. She had made it up, invented a fake law, typed it onto a fancy letterhead, and expected me to roll over and take it. That was when it became clear Brenda wasn't just a control freak. She was a fabricator, a manipulator who believed authority was something you could bluff into existence. And if she could invent ordinances, then I could invent ice walls. But before that masterstroke, I had to play a little offense. I visited the county office to make sure my land records were clean and documented. I pulled my property line maps, zoning certifications, everything. I was going to defend my land the way she claimed to defend her neighborhood, with paperwork and persistence. But while I was handling the legal side, Brenda wasn't done playing her games. 3 days after stealing my Snowblower, she installed a small sign near my mailbox. Shared equipment zone. Property subject to seasonal HOA governance. It looked official, almost believable if you weren't paying attention. The neighbors started whispering. Some believed her, others laughed, but I didn't care what they thought. I cared that she had crossed into bold-faced fraud. That little laminated lie was the final nudge I needed to put my plan into motion. I began constructing a frame, nothing dramatic, just a few wooden posts and planks positioned around the edge of my property, where Brenda often parked her luxury SUV. She had taken to using that spot as a community emergency parking zone, claiming that HOA members needed snowstorm overflow spaces. It was, of course, nonsense. But like everything Brenda did, it came wrapped in just enough bureaucracy to confuse the average person. My frame was simple but purposeful. Once the structure was up, I quietly ran a hose from my well to the top rail and waited for the temperature to drop. When it finally hit 0 degrees, I turned on the water and let the slow flood begin. Hour after hour, the water trickled down the wood, freezing into layer after layer of thick, clear ice. I didn't rush it. I wanted this to be art, a glistening monument to karma built one frosty sheet at a time. By dawn, her car, parked exactly where it shouldn't have been, was encased in a towering wall of ice, a 10-foot fortress that shimmered in the sunrise like a cathedral made of frozen glass. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Brenda came marching over in a red robe, slippers crunching through the snow, screaming before she even reached the base of the wall. She pointed, shouted, accused. I just stood on my porch, sipping coffee, Duke wagging his tail at my feet. "You vandalized my property," she screeched. "Funny," I said. "You mean the property that's on my land?" She stomped her foot. "This is illegal. I'll call the police." "Please do," I replied. "I'd love to show them the security footage. You know, the one of you dragging my Snowblower into your garage." She froze, lips twitching, eyes calculating. Then she switched tactics. "It's unsafe. That ice could collapse and damage vehicles." "Only if someone parks where they are not supposed to," I said with a shrug. "There's a sign, after all." Brenda's face contorted into something between a scowl and a seizure. She turned and stormed off, her SUV still sealed inside my homemade glacier. And just like that, the power began to shift. She thought she could steal from me without consequence. But what she hadn't realized, what she never considered, is that some people don't need meetings or clipboards to fight back. Sometimes all it takes is a hose, a cold night, and the willingness to play the long game. The morning after Brenda discovered her car frozen in a 10-foot glacial prison, the entire neighborhood buzzed with gossip. People slowed down as they drove past my house, their eyes drawn to the towering ice sculpture that now surrounded her luxury SUV like a crystal tomb. Kids walking to the bus stopped to stare. One even took a selfie. It was a small-town spectacle, and whether folks approved or not, they couldn't look away. I didn't say a word to anyone that day. I simply shoveled my walk, nodded to the passing cars, and sipped my coffee on the porch like nothing was out of the ordinary. But deep down, I knew the game had changed. I had taken the first real step. And from the look on Brenda's face as she tried to chip at the ice with a plastic snow brush, she finally realized I wasn't the kind of man she could intimidate. By noon, she had called the police. I watched from the porch as a deputy cruiser pulled up to the curb and a young officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. Brenda launched into a dramatic retelling of the crime, her voice rising and falling like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. She pointed at me, at the ice, at the hose curled neatly beside my house. The officer listened politely, then slowly walked over to me. He looked young, maybe mid-20s, and already wore the face of someone who'd seen enough small-town nonsense for one winter. "Mr. Johnson," he said, glancing at his notes. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" "Go ahead," I said, keeping my hands in my coat pockets. "Did you, intentionally create that ice structure around her car?" "I created a decorative winter display on my own property," I replied. "As permitted by county guidelines, there's no ordinance against seasonal ice formations. And as you can see," I gestured to a freshly printed sign on a stake. "I posted a warning about ongoing water flow and potential freezing conditions." The officer raised his eyebrows and gave a slow, impressed nod. "Did you know her vehicle was there?" "It's been parked on my land without permission for the past week," I said. "I figured she must have wanted it to be part of the display." He gave a short laugh before catching himself. "All right, well, from what I can see, you haven't broken any laws. Just maybe tone it down next time." "No promises," I said. Brenda was livid when the officer told her there was nothing he could do. She tried arguing, demanded escalation, insisted she wanted to speak to a supervisor. The officer just shrugged, got in his cruiser, and left her standing there in the snow, red-faced and seething. She stormed back toward her house, slipping once on a patch of ice and letting out a shriek that echoed down the street. I didn't laugh out loud, but I absolutely smiled. For the next few days, Brenda tried everything short of calling in a helicopter to thaw out her car. She brought in a generator-powered heater, which barely dented the ice. She had some guy show up with a propane torch, only to have him pack up and leave when he realized the entire block was watching him like it was the main event at the county fair. Meanwhile, I went about my business. I ran my errands, kept my driveway clear, and even delivered fresh firewood to a few older neighbors who had been snowed in. I wasn't trying to win hearts. I just lived my life the same way I always had. But people noticed. They noticed who was out there helping and who was screaming about bylaws and frostbite. Then the letters started again. This time they were even more absurd. A notice from the HOA accused me of malicious weather manipulation. Another claimed I had created a public safety hazard via intentional ice entrapment. I framed that one and hung it above my fireplace. Brenda was spiraling, and it showed in every desperate attempt she made to regain control. But I didn't just want to defend myself. I wanted to push back. So I started with small, legal acts of resistance. The rooster was the first strike. Brenda had complained early on that my one rooster crowed too loudly, so I bought 3 more. Each morning at 5 a.m., like clockwork, they greeted the neighborhood with a symphony of crows that echoed across the snow-covered hills. There was nothing in the county ordinance about livestock noise on private agricultural property. I checked twice. Next, I planted a line of sunflowers along the property boundary. It was the wrong season, of course. So I used thick plastic stalks from a local garden supplier, fake, bright yellow sunflowers that stood 10 feet tall and blocked every inch of my land from the view of the Crestwood homes that backed up against it. Brenda called them visual pollution. I called them privacy enhancements. By this point, the community started to take sides. Some folks who'd never paid attention before started asking questions. Others began to quietly show their support. Linda, a woman on the HOA board who'd always seemed a bit too quiet in meetings, walked up my drive one afternoon with a tray of cookies. She said she didn't approve of all the noise, but she respected my resolve. Then she dropped this gem. "You know, Brenda tried to find me last year because my Halloween pumpkin wasn't seasonally appropriate after November 1st. We both laughed, and just like that, an alliance was born. It was Linda who gave me the idea for the big move. She told me about the bylaws Brenda used to justify her nonsense, how most of them weren't even properly ratified, just empty threats printed on Crestwood letterhead. That's when I decided it was time to host a little community event of my own. I called up Mason, an old buddy of mine who ran the local farmers market. Together, we hatched a plan for a one-day winter festival right here on my land. We called it Snow Day Sunday. I put up flyers, advertised on the town Facebook page, and even got a few volunteers to help set up fire pits, serve hot cocoa, and bring their goats and chickens for a petting zoo. We had music, sledding, snow sculpture contests, the works. And best of all, it was entirely legal. The turnout was bigger than I expected. Dozens of families showed up, bundled in scarves and mittens, laughing and drinking cider as their kids played in the snow. The noise echoed all the way into Crestwood, and you can bet Brenda heard every minute of it. She showed up halfway through, arms flailing, clipboard in hand, demanding to know what authority I had to host a gathering of this magnitude. I just handed her a copy of the county zoning rules along with a signed permit from the local sheriff's office. She sputtered something about emergency noise curfews, but nobody was listening anymore. Parents were snapping pictures. Kids were feeding baby goats. An old man with a banjo was playing a cheerful tune while someone roasted marshmallows over a barrel fire. Brenda stood there like a misplaced school principal at a summer carnival, completely irrelevant and completely ignored. That was the turning point, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. People started to realize that maybe the rules Brenda had been enforcing weren't as solid as she claimed. Maybe the HOA wasn't a monarchy. And maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to live in fear of someone measuring their grass height with a ruler. And that realization, that was the first real crack in the ice around Brenda's empire. She had built her power on fear and control. But now, the only thing frozen solid was her car. The aftermath of Snow Day Sunday rippled through the community like a thawing river after a long freeze. Something had shifted. For the first time, people weren't just watching the feud between Brenda and me, they were choosing sides. And the funny thing was, more and more of them were siding with the guy who built a 10-foot ice fortress around a luxury SUV. That morning, I walked down to my mailbox and found something unexpected wedged between a pizza flyer and the usual junk. It was a folded note, handwritten and unsigned. All it said was, "Thank you for standing up to her. We've wanted to for years." At first, I thought it was a one-off, but over the next few days, more notes showed up. Some were slipped under my door. Some were taped to my shed. They weren't dramatic or full of details, just quiet little messages of support from neighbors who were finally feeling brave enough to whisper their dissatisfaction. Turns out, Brenda's grip on Crestwood had been made of frost and fear. Now that the ice was cracking, people were finding their voices. Linda, who had become something of an inside woman at this point, showed up again with another tray of cookies and an eyebrow raised high enough to touch the sky. She said the HOA board was in chaos. Apparently, Brenda had called an emergency meeting to discuss disciplinary action against me for disrupting neighborhood harmony. But the vote didn't go her way. Half the board abstained. A few even laughed. One guy reportedly told her, "You started this war, Brenda. You didn't expect him to just roll over, did you?" She was losing them, slowly, yes, but surely. Now, Brenda wasn't someone who handled losing well. She had built her entire persona around the illusion of control. And with that illusion slipping, she started lashing out in stranger ways. One day, she tried to get the HOA to issue a citation for the roosters, citing a fictitious noise violation clause that no one could find in any official documentation. Another day, she sent around a printed pamphlet accusing me of hosting unauthorized livestock performances on my land. Mason framed it and hung it behind the register at the farmer's market, right next to a photo of a goat in a party hat. The real blow came when the whispers turned into action. One evening, a man named Greg knocked on my door. He was tall, retired military, with a gravelly voice and a way of speaking that told you he didn't waste words. He handed me a manila envelope and said, "You didn't get this from me." Inside were copies of internal HOA emails, the kind of emails Brenda probably assumed no one would ever see, the kind that spelled out in black and white just how far she had gone off the rails. There were fake complaints filed under fabricated resident names, emails where she told board members they needed to maintain pressure on my property to ensure visual alignment with Crestwood values. She had even proposed a special HOA fee, an assessment she claimed would help fund a legal defense strategy against aggressive neighboring property owners. In other words, she wanted the residents of Crestwood to pay for her vendetta against me. According to the notes Greg included, that proposal was shut down unanimously, but the fact that she even tried was damning. Word spread quickly. Residents began to murmur openly at HOA meetings. Someone put a meme on the town Facebook group of Brenda photoshopped onto the body of Napoleon standing in front of a burning snowblower. It got over 200 likes. Even the more neutral homeowners, people who had once stayed out of it, were beginning to question why their dues were going toward drama instead of, say, fixing the broken sidewalk lights. One of them, a young mother named Megan, posted a comment that read, "I don't even like roosters, but I'd rather hear crowing at dawn than another lecture about mailbox colors." That was the vibe now. Brenda wasn't done yet, though. No, she tried one more move. One morning, I woke up to find the entrance to my property lined with brand new signs. They were sleek, metal, and clearly expensive. They read, "Private community access only. No through traffic. HOA jurisdiction enforced." It was like she was trying to build her own border wall. She even had a little sign-up list taped to a post, asking residents to report unauthorized entries. And the kicker? She used HOA funds to pay for them. That was a mistake because those signs weren't just ugly, they were illegal. The road that led to my house wasn't private. It was a county-maintained access road. I made a few phone calls, and by that afternoon, a county official arrived in a bright orange vest and a foul mood. He took one look at the signs and said, "Oh, she didn't." I showed him the documentation. He made a few calls. Within an hour, a crew was out there tearing down the signs while I watched from my porch with a bag of popcorn in hand. Brenda, naturally, came charging out of her house the moment the first post was yanked out of the ground. She demanded to know who authorized the removal, called the county worker a bureaucratic thug, and insisted that the community's safety was at risk. The man didn't even look up. He just pointed at the paperwork and said, "You don't own the road, lady. Take it up with the courthouse." She stood there frozen, not by ice this time, but by public humiliation. That incident was the final straw for many residents. The next HOA meeting was packed. People who hadn't shown up in years filled every chair in the community hall. The room buzzed with energy, not fear, but determination. Linda sent me a text right before the meeting started. "It's happening," she wrote. "They are calling the vote." I didn't attend. I didn't need to. I sat at home, warm and relaxed, letting Duke nap beside the fireplace while the town made its decision. Hours later, Linda sent another message. "She's out." 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of an entire neighborhood finally breaking free from a tyrant's grip. Brenda had officially been removed as HOA president. The board cited misuse of funds, unauthorized signage, harassment, and bringing legal liability to the community. It wasn't just a loss, it was a collapse. Her allies turned their backs. Her authority vanished. And just like that, the woman who had stolen my Snowblower and declared war on my peace and privacy was out of power. But the neighborhood wasn't finished yet. The day after the vote, I found a small box on my porch. Inside was a homemade pie and a card that read, "Thanks for showing us how to stand up. From your grateful neighbors." I stared at it for a long time, then brought it inside, placed it on the table, and poured myself a cup of coffee. It wasn't just about the Snowblower anymore. It was about principle, about reminding people that no one, not even someone with a clipboard and a board title, gets to walk all over others in the name of rules, especially not when those rules are made up on the spot and enforced with nothing but arrogance and intimidation. Brenda started a war, but I made sure I ended it on my terms. And in doing so, I helped melt the ice that had gripped the whole neighborhood for far too long. The day after Brenda was voted out of the HOA, the entire neighborhood felt different. It was subtle at first, a little lighter, a little less tense. For the first time in what felt like years, you could walk through Crestwood without seeing someone glance over their shoulder like they were being watched. Mailboxes that had been stripped of personality started sprouting little flags and quirky decals. Kids rode bikes down the street without anyone shouting about sidewalk regulations. It was like the whole community had taken a deep breath at once and realized the air no longer smelled like fear and passive aggression. Brenda's house, however, remained a silent monument to her downfall. The blinds stayed shut, and no one saw her outside. It was like she had disappeared into her living room, curled up with her shame and a stack of HOA bylaws that no longer meant anything. Then one morning, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. No one was surprised. Word spread quickly, Brenda was leaving. Whether she was forced out or leaving by choice didn't matter. The tyrant of Crestwood was packing up and heading out, and nobody was crying about it. I watched the movers load her furniture from my porch, cup of coffee in hand. It felt poetic, watching her empire boxed up in bubble wrap. I didn't wave. She didn't look in my direction. The woman who once marched up my driveway to confiscate my Snowblower now slunk into the passenger seat of her own car, windows tinted, pretending the world wasn't watching. But we were, and we remembered. That afternoon, I had a new sign made and planted it proudly at the edge of my property. It read, "Welcome to Mark's Place. No HOA. No drama. No cars allowed. People stopped to take pictures with it. Some honked as they passed by. It wasn't just a message. It was a monument, a declaration that peace had returned. But even with Brenda gone, the scars of her reign remained. The HOA board tried to pick up the pieces. They sent out an official letter of apology to the residents, and even to me. It was signed by the interim president, Richard, the same guy who'd once been too afraid to challenge Brenda, but had ultimately cast the deciding vote against her. In his letter, he admitted that the HOA had overstepped, misused authority, and failed to protect its community from internal abuse. I framed it and hung it on the wall next to the original cease and desist letter Brenda had tried to scare me with, a perfect pair of bookends to a ridiculous chapter in my life. Still, despite the apology and Brenda's departure, the cleanup wasn't just administrative. The emotional damage was harder to repair. People had been fined, harassed, and publicly embarrassed for years. It would take time for neighbors to start trusting again. But I figured I could help, not by preaching or politicking, but by continuing to live the way I always had, openly, respectfully, and maybe a little stubbornly. That weekend, I expanded the farmers' event. What started as a one-time festival turned into a regular weekend gathering. We called it Mark's Farm Days. Local vendors brought fresh bread, honey, crafts, and more. Kids played with the goats. Musicians played in the background. And the best part? People from Crestwood came. People who had once crossed the street to avoid eye contact now strolled through my fields with their kids, buying eggs and chatting like we were old friends. Linda showed up every weekend, sometimes with cookies, sometimes with gossip. One Saturday, she leaned in and said, "You know, Brenda tried to join another HOA upstate. Didn't even last a month before they booted her from the welcome committee." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped a crate of zucchini. Apparently, karma had followed Brenda to her new kingdom, and this time she was on the receiving end of the rule book she used to weaponize. The new HOA president didn't tolerate challenges. She got cited for having a lawn 2 inches too high and for parking too close to a fire hydrant. That, according to Linda, was the final straw. Brenda listed the house within weeks. It was the kind of poetic justice you don't even have to script. Back in Crestwood, life was finally starting to feel like it belonged to the residents again. Without Brenda breathing down their necks, people loosened up. One guy, Greg, finally got to repaint his shutters a color he actually liked without getting a threatening notice. Megan let her kids draw chalk art on the sidewalk without worrying someone would photograph it and send a complaint to the HOA board. It wasn't just about freedom, it was about healing. One day, Richard and a few other HOA board members walked up my driveway, holding a basket of baked goods. I thought it was a joke at first, but no, they were serious. They came to make peace. Richard cleared his throat and said, "We know we can't undo everything that happened, but we'd like to start fresh." I let them talk, listened to their apologies. Then I offered them coffee, and we sat on the porch like civil folks. We talked about fence lines, snow removal, the importance of not giving anyone too much power just because they have a clipboard and a firm handshake. It wasn't a treaty, but it was enough. We shook hands when they left, and I genuinely believed the worst was behind us. Over time, the neighborhood changed. The rigid atmosphere gave way to something softer, more human, more real. And for the first time, people stopped referring to me as that stubborn guy with the ice wall and started calling me by name. I wasn't just the guy who stood up to Brenda. I was Mark, the man who reminded them that standing up to tyranny, no matter how petty, matters. I never saw Brenda again. Rumor had it she moved out of state, bought a condo in Florida where she could be close to an HOA retirement community. Maybe she's found a new set of bylaws to cling to. Maybe she's still out there measuring lawns and filing complaints. But wherever she is, I hope she remembers the ice. The thick, silent, immovable wall that taught her what happens when you mess with the wrong man at the wrong time of year. As for me, I kept building. The farm grew, the community thrived, and every winter, as the first snowflakes began to fall, I'd smile to myself. Not because I missed the chaos, but because I'd lived through it, stood tall, and came out better on the other side. And every time a new neighbor moved in and asked about the infamous Snowblower story, I'd lean back, sip my coffee, and say, "Well, pull up a chair." It all started when someone thought they could steal from me in the middle of a blizzard. And that, my friend, is a tale worth telling.